This is Dr. Krause, and I'd like to offer a couple of videos here on the institutions of Israel. And this first one, part one, I want to talk about the law and the temple, tabernacle, and temple of Israel. As much as anything, the nation of Israel was defined by its law. The Hebrew term is Torah, which means instruction or law. It can mean law, not quite the way that we mean law as a just legal code, that something that you might break and be arrested by the police. There was much more to it than that for them. But it was their inheritance. It was their most prized possession. I want to give you three aspects of the law of Israel that we find in the Old Testament.
First, they believed the law was given by the Lord. It was not a human creation. A couple of verses I want you to see here. In Exodus 24, you get this kind of story. The Lord said to Moses, "Come up to me on the mountain and wait there, and I will give you the tablets of stone." So Moses doesn't go up on the mountain and write the law. It's given to Moses by the Lord. And then in Deuteronomy, you get this idea. When he, and I'm supplying here the king, when the king has taken the throne of his kingdom, this is Moses talking about the future, when the king has taken the throne of his kingdom, he shall have a copy of this law written for him in the presence of the Levitical priests. It shall remain with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, and so forth here. So couple of things. It's not a human creation, and as such, even the king was to be subject to it. It's not the king who makes the law. The king is subject to the law, which is really an incredible idea. Nobody else in the ancient world had any sort of concept of law like that. So not given by the Lord, or it was given by the Lord, not a human creation. And secondly, it was capable of making Israel a great nation. Let's look at a verse here in Deuteronomy 4. See, just as the Lord my God has charged me, I now teach you statutes and ordinances for you to observe in the land that you're about to enter and occupy. You must observe them diligently, for this will show your wisdom and discernment to the peoples, who, when they hear all these statutes, will say, "Surely this great nation is a wise and discerning people." So the idea here is if they would follow the law, all the other nations would think that they are a great nation, for they would be a great nation. And third, then another aspect of the law, it was seen as perfect. It was perfectly just. The justice of the law was perfect in every aspect. You see this in a lot of places in the Old Testament. Let me give you one from Psalm 19. The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The decrees of the Lord are sure, making wise the simple. So Psalms are loaded with this. Psalm 119, almost every verse in it is something like this. The Pentateuch then portrays the giving of the law at Sinai as a primary purpose for the Exodus itself. This is a picture of the stone staircase that goes all the way from St. Catherine's Monastery at the base of Mount Sinai all the way to the top of the mountain. And I took this picture myself many years ago when I was in Israel. The stone archway here that you see, I guess, is no longer there. I don't know if it collapsed from an earthquake or something, which they have there. But people that have been there recently tell me that they've not seen this. So I guess it's kind of a rare picture. But if God was to make a nation for himself, God's rules and his ordinances must govern that nation. Otherwise, how could it be his nation? Another important thing you see, and we'll talk more about this later, but in the book of Second Kings, toward the end of the period of Kings, and shortly before the destruction of the temple, they discover this book of the law in the temple as they're refurbishing it. This is during the time of King Josiah. And it leads to a brief period of national revival, but it's just incredible in the first place that they would lose the law, and then you see the power of the law in that text to change the nation itself. So, what does this mean for Christians? It's important for Christians to remember that the law of Israel was intended to be both a legal code to govern a nation and a guide to regulate the nation's religion. In this, it contains both civil and religious laws. There is no such thing for them as separation of church and state, and neither of these categories is strictly applicable to Christian who might be under the new covenant, under grace, not under law. So both types of law, however, contain theological information and doctrinal ideas that are of great value for us today, but we have to be very judicious in how we study this, and we don't jerk a verse out of the book of Deuteronomy and make it a law for the church. It just doesn't work that way. So the first of these institutions, the law. Second, I want to talk about the temple. The Temple of Israel was a center for priestly functions of sacrifice and of intercessory prayer for the nation. The temple was the site of the most important religious festivals and rites of the nation of Israel, and perhaps most importantly, it housed the famous Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant was important because it symbolized the actual presence or the glory of God. You may have heard of this idea of the glory of God, the presence of God, sometimes called the Shekinah or the Shekinah of God. The temple actually had many historical stages. The first stage we would call the tabernacle, which in the Pentateuch is called the tent of meeting. This is sort of a precursor to the temple. It was fabricated in the wilderness, and it was used until the time of Solomon. So this is approximately 1450, 1440 BC until about 970 BC, a period of almost 400 years. So I'm sure a lot of repair and replacement of worn out parts during this period. The tabernacle was designed to be semi-portable, but not real portable, but it could be moved from place to place, and we see this happening. It's kind of interesting during the period of the judges and even the period of King Saul and King David. The idea of tabernacle, it's not in Jerusalem yet, but it seems to be kind of a little more permanent, but probably made out of wood, not out of stone. But there was a place that's not quite the temple yet, but a little bit more permanent than this tent that they carried around in the wilderness. So secondly, we get the Temple of Solomon that was built in Jerusalem. It's really built to fulfill David's desire to have a fitting house for the Lord in Jerusalem. It was a fabulous building. It was constructed using very fine craftsmanship and extremely expensive materials. So the Temple of Solomon was dedicated about 970 BC and then is destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC. So it lasts for almost 400 years. So they got a lot of use out of this building before it was destroyed. So Jerusalem sits without a temple for a period of about 70 years. And finally then we get the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem, and we refer to this as the second temple, or sometimes it's called Zerubbabel's temple or even Ezra's temple. This was a temple that was rebuilt in Jerusalem by Jews who were allowed to return to Israel by the Persian king Cyrus the Great, and it is completed about 515 BC. And it was in no way as grand as Solomon's temple. They just did not have the resources to do that, but certainly a very functional building. And this is the temple that then is still around in some ways at the time of Jesus. But at the time of Jesus, and this gets a little beyond the Old Testament, we get to Herod's temple. Herod, his temple was a grand reconstruction of this second temple, the temple of Ezra. And Herod was the king of Israel. He wasn't really a Jew. He was an outsider from the nation called Idumea, which is sort of the Edomites, the cousins of the Israelites through the brother of Jacob named Esau. So this is Herod the Great. He's the king when Jesus is born, and he began to rebuild this temple about 16 BC. I'll say more about this in New Testament survey, but that project was still ongoing at the time of Jesus' ministry. In fact, was not finished until AD 62, so long after the death of Herod. This is 65, 68 years after the death of Herod. This temple then, finished AD 62, was destroyed a few years later by the Romans in AD 70. So it was only completed for 8 years before the Romans destroyed it, and still has not been rebuilt. So Jerusalem is without a temple today.